The 200's era of the UFC is over. This era has been iconic with some amazing fights, moments and pay-per-views. Today we are going to be breaking down the fighters and the best of them. Since the 10th of July 2016, which was UFC 200, we have seen some amazing fighters, but who has been the best of them throughout all of the 200's and this era? Today we will be breaking down the top 20 and crowning a king or a queen of the 200's and finding out who has been the best UFC fighter of the 200's era. This is the Fight franchise and the top 20 fighters of the UFC 200's era. Before we get started, so we have an understanding of how we are breaking down this list, the categories we'll be ranking the fighters on is their records from UFC 200's onwards, the caliber of opposition they have beaten, their achievements within the octagon, their performances they have put on, and the activity and number of fights within this time frame. So now the ground rules have been established, let's get started. Number 20, Stipe Miocic. The greatest heavyweight champion in UFC history, Stipe Miocic, in terms of the best fighters in UFC history, would rank quite favourably. However, he just makes this list due to excelling in certain categories. The start of the 200's era was very favourable to Stipe as he entered as champion, as he had just beaten Fabricio Werdum for the title at UFC 198. He would secure 3 amazing wins to start the 200's, beating Alistair Overeem by KO to defend his title, and then beat former champion Junior Dos Santos by KO, and then beat the scariest fighter heavyweight had ever seen at that point, Francis Ngannou, in a great 5-round performance. He would lose his belt in the next fight against DC by KO, but avenged this loss in a comeback win versus DC, and then beat DC in the trilogy bout to win the rivalry overall. Francis Ngannou earned a rematch where he would brutally KO Stipe, and he hasn't fought since then. He finished this era with 5 wins, 2 losses, but achieved some great history, becoming the best heavyweight champion in UFC history, setting the record number of consecutive title defenses, and the opposition he has beaten during this time was very good. He was just let down by inactivity. Had he been more active or beat Jon Jones when they were scheduled to fight and the fight not fall through, he would have ranked higher on this list, but deserves a spot nonetheless. Number 19, Henry Cejudo. Henry Cejudo is a strange character. I could finish at that assessment and most people would agree, but in context of this list, he is a strange character to rank. In terms of achievements and some of the opposition he has beat, he ranks quite high, but in terms of activity, a lot like Stipe, he ranks poorly, but that is due to his own decision to retire mid-career. Henry before the 200's would be KO'd by Demetrius Johnson at UFC 197. Once the 200's era started, Henry Cejudo would lose a decision versus Joseph Benavidez. Following this, he got 2 great wins, stopping Wilson Hayes and beating Sergio Pettis, and due to a lack of competition at flyweight, he would be rematching Demetrius Johnson for the flyweight title. Cejudo would have a brilliant fight and win a decision and win the world title from one of the best MMA fighters of all time. He would follow this up and defend his flyweight title against the then bantamweight champion who was on EPO, TJ Dillashaw, KOing him to defend his title. With TJ stripped of the bantamweight title, Cejudo went up and faced Marlon Moraes for vacant bantamweight gold and put on a brilliant comeback performance, stopping Moraes in the 3rd round to become a 2-division world champion. He followed this up beating the best bantamweight of all time, Dominic Cruz, to defend his bantamweight title, and then would subsequently retire and would call out fighters during his retirement until he returned to face Aljo for the bantamweight title, losing a close decision, and then at UFC 298 was beaten by Merab. Had he not retired and would have gone on a run after beating Cruz, he may have ranked within the top 5, but 2 belts secured and wins over the likes of DJ, TJ and Cruz earned him a spot on the list. Number 18, Alex Pereira. This may seem to some fans like a crazy entry, and a fighter who on the surface and with the short time spent in the UFC shouldn't make this list. But when you talk about the 200's era and which fighter made the most of their time, no one on this list comes close to Alex Pereira. Alex would debut at UFC 268 and get off to a flying start. Literally, he flatlined Andreas Michailidis by flying knee. He would then go to a decision and win against Bruno Silva. He would then flatline and KO future middleweight champion Sean Strickland, and then followed this up and had an epic fight versus Israel Adesanya, securing the TKO in the 5th round to dethrone Izzy from atop of the middleweight throne. He would be brutally KO'd in the rematch versus Izzy, where Alex decided to go up a weight class to 205. Alex would debut at light heavyweight and win a decision against former champion Jan Blachowicz, and then face Jiří Procházka for vacant light heavyweight gold, and would win by 2nd round TKO. In 7 fights in the UFC, he has beaten 4 world champions, dethroning one of the best middleweight champions ever, became a champion 2 weight divisions in record time, and had some great performances. Had he started in the UFC earlier, he could have ranked way higher on this list, but if you want to know how impressive he has become, he is headlining the massive UFC 300 card. Number 17, Weili Zhang. The first ever Chinese champion in the UFC has shown a massive improvement in her game year on year, and is improving in the sport and has become a force to be reckoned with in the strawweight division. Weili Zhang debuted in the UFC at UFC 227, winning a decision, and then would follow this up with a brilliant submission win. Zhang would win a decision and beat Tecia Torres, and earned a title shot against newly minted champion Jessica Andrade, who had just brutally KO'd Rose Namajunas. Zhang would put on an excellent striking display on the feet, finishing Andrade in less than a minute to become the undisputed champion. She would follow this up with one of the best women's fight of all time, defending her title against Joanna Jędrzejczyk in an absolute war where Zhang won the close decision. She would be brutally KO'd in her next fight by Rose Namajunas, losing her title, but got an immediate rematch where Zhang lost again to Rose in a close split decision, which some fans gave her the win. Zhang would face Joanna again and KO her with a beautiful spinning back fist to retire Joanna and earn a title shot versus Carla Esparza, submitting her to regain back her title, and then followed this defending her title in a dominant display versus Amanda Lemos. Zhang has beaten some of the best women at strawweight and had some great performances and secured the belt twice, and her only blemishes during this time frame were those fights with Rose, a great run in the 200s and a well-worthy spot on the list. Number 16, Jon Jones, the GOAT himself. Jon Jones is easily the greatest UFC fighter of all time, with the only real case against him you can argue is GSP, but the consensus is Jones is the GOAT. But in terms of the 200s era, a lot like others, Jones is severely let down by his inactivity during this time period. Jones was supposed to headline the UFC 200 card, but was stripped due to his PED use, which saw him wait to compete, where he faced DC at UFC 214, where Jones put on an epic performance, KOing DC in the third round, but this was overturned due to a no contest due to Jon Jones' PED use. Once DC went up and won the heavyweight gold, Jones returned and stopped and finished Alexander Gustafsson for the vacant light heavyweight title. He would follow this up with a dominant display beating Anthony Smith, and then win a close decision versus Thiago Santos. And then he would have a competitive fight versus Dominic Reyes, which some fans thought Reyes won, but Jones won the close decision. He, like a few others, took a break from the sport and returned to face Cyril Gane for vacant heavyweight gold, schooling Gane in just over 2 minutes, submitting him to become a champion in a second division. Had Jones stayed active after his win versus Reyes and defended his light heavyweight title and beat Glover again, Blachowicz and Yuri, and gone up and won the heavyweight title, he would easily been a shout for number 1. However, with the lack of activity and PED infractions hinders him going any higher. Number 15, Alexander Pantoja. The flyweight division has seen an emergence of great fighters and talent since Demetrius Johnson left, with all the champs being excellent fighters, with Henry Cejudo, Davis Figueiredo, Brandon Moreno, and Alexander Pantoja, who earns a rightful spot on this list. Pantoja, since joining the UFC in January 2017, has put on an excellent run of 11 wins and 3 losses, where he has climbed the ranks of the flyweight division all the way to becoming the champion. He joined the UFC and started his 200s era with 2 wins and then lost a decision to Dustin Ortiz, who would secure 3 wins following this, securing 2 finishes and a decision against future champion Brandon Moreno. But he would lose a decision in a great fight of the night versus Davison Figueiredo. He would KO Matt Schnell in an epic performance and then lose a decision to Askar Askarov. A decent record and set of performances to this point, but it was from here onwards he would secure an epic set of wins to the top. He would beat Manel Kape by decision and then beat and submit both Brandon Royval and Alex Perez, and then win the title in an epic war versus Brandon Moreno, and defend his title in a great performance against Brandon Royval. He has a great record and set of wins and even has some brilliant performances along the way, and when you look at his losses, they were all decision losses which were close. Both Figgy and Moreno were close shouts, but Pantoja makes the list for beating most of the guys in the division and securing an epic record and streak to the top, and being super active within this era. Number 14, Khabib Nurmagomedov. A name synonymous with the 200s era, Khabib is easily the most dominant fighter on this list, smashing his competition, and a lot like others, had he been more active instead of retiring, he could have easily been number 1. Khabib started this era smashing and beating Michael Johnson and submitting him at UFC 205, and following this would be paired with Tony Ferguson. However, Khabib pulled out due to complications with a weight cut. He returned and battered Edson Barboza and would face Tony Ferguson for undisputed gold, so Khabib instead beat Al Iaquinta for vacant gold to become champion, while former champ Conor McGregor had just come off his mega fight with Mayweather and was in a jail cell after attacking the bus Khabib was on. Khabib faced McGregor McGregor in the biggest fight in UFC history and smashed him, and would jump the cage after the fight and get suspended for 9 months. He returned to face Dustin Poirier in Abu Dhabi, submitting him in the 3rd round to defend his title. He was scheduled to fight Tony Ferguson again, which was prevented due to the pandemic, where Ferguson was battered by Justin Gaethje for interim gold. So Khabib would face Justin Gaethje, schooling him and submitting him in the 2nd round, and would retire after the fight after it was his mother's request after his father's passing. Genuinely seeing Islam as champion, who is similar to Khabib, shows Khabib could still have been champion right now had he not retired, but with 6 dominant wins against some tough competition earns him a rightful spot on the list. Number 13, Aljamain Sterling. For some strange reason, Aljo is hated by MMA fans and the MMA community. Maybe it is his fight style or his personality, or maybe it is how he became the first fighter to win the world title via disqualification. But when you put your hatred for Aljo aside and look at the work he has done over the 200's era, you will easily understand why Aljo makes the list. Aljo's first fight of the 200's era was a close loss to Rafael Assunção. He then went on to win 2 decisions versus Augusto Mendes and former champion Renan Barão, but he would then lose via vicious KO to Marlon Moraes, who secured a wicked knee to put Aljo out cold. Aljo rebuilt himself after this loss and beat Brett Jones, submitted Cody Stamann, beat Jimmy Rivera and Pedro Munoz, and then submitted Corey Sandhagen in just under 1 minute 30 seconds to earn a title shot versus Petr Yan. Aljo put on a terrible performance versus Yan, where on the ground Yan threw an illegal knee where Aljo won the belt via DQ. The 2 rematch where Aljo returned after neck surgery, where Aljo was much better, winning a close decision versus Yan. He would follow this and beat an injured TJ Dillashaw, and then beat a returning Henry Cejudo, securing 3 consecutive title defenses at bantamweight. He would be KO'd in his next fight by Sean O'Malley, which was a real shame for Aljo. But activity throughout the 200's, fighting all the tough bantamweights and some great performances, the only thing that lets Aljo down is how he won the belt and also his title defenses being close wins and beating an injured Dillashaw. Nonetheless, easily one of the better fighters of the 200's era. Number 12, Francis Ngannou. The hardest hitting MMA fighter of all time murdered the heavyweight division with his otherworldly KO power, which saw him go on an amazing run to capture heavyweight gold. Francis joined the UFC and got 2 brilliant KO wins, but from UFC 200 onwards he got 3 more finishes, with 2 KOs and 1 submission, where he would face decorated heavyweight Alistair Overeem, where Francis nuked Overeem and put him out cold to earn a title shot against earlier entry Stipe Miocic. Francis would lose a 5-round decision to Miocic, who chose to wrestle and dominate Francis, where he was exposed for having no cardio. He followed this with one of the most boring fights in UFC history, losing a decision to Derek Lewis, where nothing really happened. Francis would go back to the drawing board and rebuild himself, and beat and KO'd Curtis Blades, Cain Velasquez, Junior Dos Santos, and Jairzinho Rozenstruik to re-earn a title shot versus Stipe Miocic. This time Francis had shown vast improvements in his wrestling and cardio, KOing Stipe to realise his goal and become heavyweight champion. He would defend his title against a new breed of heavyweight in Cyril Gane in a decision win and would leave the UFC due to dispute regarding pay. Francis even had a successful boxing match with Tyson Fury and a not so successful boxing match against Anthony Joshua. Nonetheless, a great UFC run with brilliant stoppages, winning the title and coming back from 2 shocking performances and losses. Francis Ngannou's path of destruction will be remembered fondly when looking back at the 200's era. Number 11, Dustin Poirier. Spoiler alert, the only person on this list who did not hold an undisputed world title. Nonetheless, Dustin Poirier over the 200's era has had one hell of a run in the lightweight division, fighting a stacked group of fighters and names, all while putting on some iconic performances. Dustin Poirier's first fight of the 200's era was against Michael Johnson, where he was brutally KO'd. Poirier would return and win a decision versus Jim Miller, and then would have a no contest versus Eddie Alvarez due to Alvarez throwing an illegal knee. He would then go on an epic streak, submitting Anthony Pettis, KOing Justin Gaethje in an absolute war, finishing Eddie Alvarez in a rematch after their no contest, and then beat at the time featherweight champ Max Holloway for interim lightweight gold in an absolute war. He would face Khabib and lose via submission, but would bounce back in another war, beating and battering Dan Hooker. He then faced Conor McGregor in an epic clash, becoming the first person to KO McGregor in the octagon. He then beat McGregor again in the trilogy after McGregor got injured, but would lose his subsequent title match against Charles Oliveira. He would then return against Michael Chandler in the fight of the night and submit him in the 3rd round, and then lost via head kick to Justin Gaethje for the BMF title, and most recently went to war with scary up-and-comer Benoit Saint Denis and would KO him. For achievements, Dustin Poirier doesn't rank that high, but in all other categories he stacks up high. Loads of activity, great performances and wars against stacked competition in the lightweight division. Dustin Poirier highly deserves his spot on the list as one of the best fighters of the 200s, even if he failed to win undisputed gold. Number 10, Robert Whittaker. Good old Bobby Knuckles. Robert Whittaker over the 200's era had some epic wars and performances, and had it not been for another standout middleweight existing, would have probably ranked way higher on this list. After having terrible luck at welterweight, Whittaker would go up to middleweight and went on a tear. His era of the 200's began with beating Derek Brunson via stoppage and then beating Jacare Souza by stoppage as well. He would then have a war with Yoel Romero for the interim middleweight title, winning a decision, and after GSP retired would be promoted to undisputed champ. He would rematch Yoel Romero in an absolute war and win a close split decision. He would then be tasked to defend his title against Israel Adesanya but would be KO'd in the second round. It would be back to the drawing board for Whittaker, where he became the gatekeeper of the middleweight division, beating up-and-comers Darren Till, Jared Cannonier and Kelvin Gastelum. After those wins, he would earn a title shot and a rematch against Adesanya, doing better than last time but still coming up short in a decision loss. He would follow this up with a brilliant performance, piecing up Marvin Vettori and then lost to Dricus du Plessis. But at UFC 298 he went to war and beat Paulo Costa, a staple atop of the middleweight division throughout the 200's era, facing the best of the best, putting on epic performances where only two guys have ever bested him. Robert Whittaker is most certainly one of the best fighters of the 200's era. Number 9. Max Holloway. Max Holloway is a legendary MMA fighter and is easily going to be a future Hall of Famer in the UFC, and if it wasn't for a certain Australian existing, he may have been number 1 on this list. Max Holloway was entering the 200's era on an epic 9-fight win streak, where he would at UFC 206 face Anthony Pettis for interim featherweight gold, finishing Showtime in the second round. He would unify the title and beat former undisputed champion Jose Aldo by TKO, and then in the rematch he would do the same again, TKOing Aldo in the third round. He followed this up with an epic performance, beating Brian Ortega in a 4-round war, painting a bloody picture on Ortega's face, winning via doctor stoppage. He went up to 155 pounds and came up short in a war versus Dustin Poirier for interim gold, but came back down and defended his belt versus Frankie Edgar. He would lose back-to-back decisions versus Alex Volkanovski in 2 close fights, where some people in the rematch thought Max won. He would batter Calvin Kattar and beat Yair Rodriguez and face Alex Volkanovski again, this time where he was comfortably beat. He then in 2023 beat up-and-coming Arnold Allen and KO'd the legendary Korean Zombie. Epic wins against the best at featherweight, title defenses, brilliant performances, and though he had 4 losses in the 200's era, 3 of them were against Volk, and one of those up a division against the bigger Poirier. An epic fighter, blessed rightfully earns his spot in the top 10. Number 8. Charles Oliveira. In terms of activity on this list, Charles comes in first with 17 fights since UFC 200 took place, with some close runner-ups coming shortly. So in terms of activity, he ticks that box with ease. In terms of his record, 13 wins, 4 losses, a great record when you consider how active he was. But what makes Charles great, his first 4 fights of the 200's era was 1 win versus Will Brooks and 3 losses versus Anthony Pettis, Ricardo Lamas and Paul Felder, and he lost all these by stoppage. But following the Felder loss, Oliveira amassed one of the best streaks on this list, winning 11 in a row, 10 via stoppage. Oliveira would buzzsaw through the lightweight division as the competition got progressively better, all the way till he came to Tony Ferguson, who was the only person he couldn't finish, but Oliveira sure tried. He then faced Michael Chandler for vacant gold after Khabib retired and had an epic 2-round war where he KO'd Chandler to become undisputed champion. Then he defended his title against previously mentioned Dustin Poirier and then went to war with an absolute madman in Justin Gaethje and submitted him. He would lose his title versus Islam Makhachev but bounced back and beat up-and-coming Beneil Dariush by KO. 12 of his 13 wins in this era are finishes. He won the belt, put on epic performances and was active throughout. Oliveira is more than worthy of his high spot on this list. Number 7. Valentina Shevchenko. Of every champion over the 200's era, Valentina Shevchenko holds the distinction of the fighter with the most consecutive title defenses with 7. Valentina's run over the 200's was a bit of a strange one. With only 2 women's divisions, she was competing at women's bantamweight, where she was undersized but had a great success due to her talent and skill level. Her run in the 200's era began with wins over former bantamweight champion Holly Holm and future bantamweight champion Juliana Pena, where a title shot was next against Amanda Nunes. Valentina Shevchenko lost a close decision versus Amanda Nunes, but the fans debated that win, with many thinking Valentina won. The UFC finally created a women's flyweight division, and Valentina opted to move down to a natural weight class and batter and submitted Priscilla Cachoeira. She would win the vacant flyweight title versus former strawweight champion Joanna Jędrzejczyk. What followed this was 7 title defenses where she displayed amazing levels of MMAs with TKO KOs over Caitlin Chikagian, Jessica Andrade and Lauren Murphy, and an epic head kick versus Jessica Ai. Valentina also had decision wins over Jennifer Maia and Liz Caramouche, and a close decision win versus Talia Santos. Valentina would be dethroned by Alexa Grasso, and then the two would have an epic rematch where the fight ended up being a draw, with only being bested by Nunes, which was a close decision, and Grasso by submission after a long title reign. Valentina showed a great array of high-level MMA during the 200s and more than deserves her spot in the top 10. Number 6. Islam Makhachev, the pound for pound best fighter in the world as of making this list today. Islam Makhachev, many fans would argue, should be number 1 on this list, as in terms of the 200s era, he has the best record of anyone on this list at 13 wins, 0 losses. But when you take a deeper dive, yes, impressive, but his level of competition on his way to the top is what hinders him breaking into the top 5. He would start the 200s era with 2 decision wins, and then KO Gleason Tebow, and then submit Cajun Johnson. He would then secure a win versus Arman Sarukian, which is a win which has aged well. Then Islam scored wins over Davi Ramos, Drew Dober and Thiago Moises, and then his toughest and highest ranked competition to that point of his career, Dan Hooker. He was gearing up to face tougher competition in RDA, but he got injured and would then finish Bobby Green. And with Charles Oliveira clearing out the division, Islam got a title shot. Islam would school Oliveira over 2 rounds and win via submission to become undisputed lightweight champion. He followed this in a super fight where he defended his title versus featherweight champ Alex Volkanovski, where the two best pound for pound fighters in the world took on each other, where Islam won a close decision and a hotly debated decision. He was set to defend his title against Charles Oliveira again, but he pulled out due to an injury, where Volk stepped in on short notice, where Islam would head kick Volk to defend his title. Yes, a brilliant win streak of 13 wins with some impressive performances, but a bulk of that is against lesser competition than those who are coming up next, which is what hinders Islam breaking into the top 5. Nonetheless, an epic fighter who over the 200s has worked himself up to be the best pound for pound fighter in the world today. Number 5. Leon Edwards. The current welterweight champ as of recording this video and one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world, Leon Rocky Edwards has been on a legendary welterweight run since the turn of UFC 200, which has taken him to the top of the 170 pound division. His era of the 200s has been an 11 fight win streak with an unfortunate no contest within this run. He worked his way up the rankings with some great wins, beating Vicente Luque and Brian Barberena, and then Peter Sabota, and then won 3 decisions versus Donald Cerrone, Gunnar Nelson and then RDA to catapult him up the top of the welterweight rankings. However, many fans weren't hot on Edwards due to his performances being great but lacking that X factor. He would face fellow standout welterweight Belal Muhammad, but would be a no contest due to Leon accidentally eye-poking Belal. He then squared off against Nate Diaz and schooled him for nearly the full 5 rounds until the last minute, where Diaz rocked Edwards and had him on skates until the end of the fight. He would be next in line for the title versus Usman, as Kamaru had cleared out all the competition. They squared off at UFC 278, where Leon won the first round, but Usman dominated rounds 2, 3 and 4, and even the 5th round, until with a minute left in the fight, Leon threw a head kick to flatline Usman and dethroned the pound for pound number 1 in the world to become champion. He would follow this up with 2 defenses against Usman back home in England, then beat Colby via decision. Undefeated throughout the 200s, the second ever champ from England, an epic moment to win the title. He has beaten great competition at welterweight. Leon could be in contention for number 1 if he had some more definitive performances on the way up and in his title defenses, but an excellent fighter, well worthy of his spot in the top 5. Number 4. Israel Adesanya. The last starbender burst on the UFC scene at UFC 221 and is a character and fighter synonymous with the UFC 200s era, who went on an epic run across the middleweight division with his legendary striking style. From epic entrances to brilliant performances to a great title reign and activity against the best of the best at middleweight, Izzy more than deserves his spot in the top 5. Izzy burst on the scene and in the space of 1 year won 5 fights, debuting and finishing Rob Wilkinson, winning decisions versus Marvin Vettori and Brad Tavares, stopping Derek Brunson at MSG, and then having an epic clash and win versus Anderson Silva. This activity shot Izzy up the middleweight rankings, who went to war across 5 rounds versus Kelvin Gastelum, where he won a decision to claim interim middleweight gold. He then faced off against previously mentioned Robert Whittaker, KOing the Reaper to become undisputed middleweight champion. He would defend his title against Yoel Romero in a dud and a snooze fest, but would bounce back against rising contender Paulo Costa, KOing him to defend his title. Then next, Izzy dared to be great and get a second belt at 205, but came up short Short versus Jan Blachowicz. He would go back down to middleweight and rack up 3 title defenses in a row versus Robert Whittaker in their rematch, against Vettori in their rematch from early in Izzy's career, and a fresh contender in Jared Cannonier, winning that by decision as well. He would be dethroned by a ghost from his past in Alex Pereira, losing his belt in an epic clash at MSG, but bounced back in the rematch and KO'd Alex Pereira out cold to reclaim his belt. But he would lose his next bout and his title in a true upset versus Sean Strickland. The 200's, Izzy was a defining figure of this with his activity, some epic fights and performances, and even had 5 title defenses and claiming back his belt after he lost it. He is easily one of the best fighters of the UFC 200's era. Number 3. Alexander Volkanovski. The arguable best featherweight in UFC history, Alexander the Great Volkanovski over the 200's was one of the greatest fighters of the era and put on a legendary run which is one of the best and can be stacked up against every other fighter on this list. Alex Volkanovski would debut in the UFC and go on a 7-fight win streak, securing great wins and finishes, even beating and stopping standout featherweight Chad Mendes and beating one of the greatest featherweights of all time in Jose Aldo. Following this legendary 7-fight win streak, he would be paired with at the time champ and fellow featherweight on this list, Max Holloway, where he would win a great decision to achieve his dream and become world champion. He would defend his title against Max Holloway in a close fight, which some fans did think Max won the fight, but he would follow this up with an excellent win over Brian Ortega, where he defended some close submissions and battered Ortega over 5 rounds. He would then batter the Korean Zombie over 4 rounds to defend his title once again, and then put on one of the best performances of all time, schooling Max Holloway on the feet over 5 rounds in their trilogy bout to separate himself from his fierce rival. He would go to chase greatness versus Islam Makhachev and go for champ status, where both men went to war, where Volk lost a close decision which many fans thought he won. He then defended his featherweight title once again versus Yair Rodriguez, battering him and finishing him over 3 rounds. But he would go for champ status once again on short notice, this time losing via brutal head kick to Islam Makhachev. He would, following this loss, go back to featherweight to defend his title and lost via a brutal KO to Ilia Topuria. An epic run throughout the 200's, winning 13 fights, facing pound for pound greats in the run like Max Holloway and Islam Makhachev, 5 title defenses, a great record and performances. It was only his 2 recent KO losses to Islam and Ilia which let him down from a higher spot on the list. Nonetheless, a brilliant fighter who deserves his spot in the top 3. Number 2. Amanda Nunes. The fighter who kicked off the 200's era and main evented the legendary UFC 200 pay-per-view. Amanda Nunes has had an epic run throughout the 200's and has solidified herself as the greatest female fighter in MMA history, and it was all built off what she had done on this epic run. She kicked off the main event of UFC 200, winning the bantamweight title versus Miesha Tate via first round submission. She followed this up facing former dominant champ Ronda Rousey, KOing her in 1 round. She won a close decision against Valentina Shevchenko and then beat up and finished Raquel Pennington. She went up a division to women's featherweight, taking on the scariest female fighter of all time, Chris Cyborg, and battered her in under a minute to become double champ and the first female double champion in history. She head kicked Holly Holm in round 1 to defend her bantamweight title again, and then defended her belt against Jermaine Durandamine. She went back up to featherweight and defended the belt twice versus Felicia Spencer and Megan Anderson, but the Lioness finally got beat in a monumental upset where Juliana Pena shocked the world, submitting Nunes in the 2nd round. She avenged her loss versus Pena, battering her across 5 rounds to get her belt back, and then defended her belt at 135 pounds one last time and retired. Seeing the state of the division now, she would still easily be champion today, which shows how many levels she was above the rest of the women at 130 and 145 pounds, and genuinely there is a strong case you can make for her at number 1. Her only blemish on this list is her monumental upset loss to Juliana Pena. Had this loss not taken place, she may have snatched the crown for number 1, but a silver medal is an excellent place for the Lioness to finish off. Number 1. Kamaru Usman, the best of the 200's. Yes, that's right. Kamaru Usman wins the fight franchise honour of the best fighter of the UFC 200's era. And yes, it is close and you can argue someone else, as there are so many great fighters on this list. But nobody was better during the 200's, we believe, than Kamaru Usman. He would at the turn of the 200's put on an epic win streak, securing epic wins over the likes of Wally Alves, Sean Strickland, Sergio Moraes, Emil Meek, Damian Maia and RDA, where his fight style would overwhelm his opponents and he would dominate and steamroll to the top of the division, where he faced then champ Tyron Woodley. He would batter and school Woodley in a 5-round domination to become champion. He would defend his title against Colby Covington in a 5-round war where he finished Colby in the 5th round, where he showcased his heart and determination and will to win. He would win a 5-round decision against Jorge Masvidal, which was not the most exciting, but he then put on performances which made him the best fighter in the world and the pound for pound best. He would beat Gilbert Burns in an excellent performance to defend his title. He would flatline Jorge Masvidal in another excellent title defense, and then have another brilliant performance and win, beating Colby Covington again to defend his title for the 5th time in a row. He would face Leon Edwards, where he defended his title and was 1 minute away from defending his belt until he lost his title and win streak to one of the best head kicks of all time. He would face Edwards in the rematch and the trilogy and lose a decision he fought great in, and then lost a short notice bout versus Khamzat Chimaev, which many fans thought he should have won or at least got a draw. An excellent record, amazing competition fought throughout, brilliant performances and constant activity, and when you think he was 1 minute away from tying Anderson Silva's record for the most consecutive wins in UFC history, just shows the level he was operating at. Even his losses, a head kick from the MMA gods and 2 valiant and close fought decisions. Kamaru Usman was so good during this era that many fans started comparing him to GSP as the best welterweight of all time. He was a generational great during this time, so deservedly so, Kamaru Usman wins the #1 for the best fighter in the UFC over the 200's era. Did you enjoy the video? Let us know down in the comments below. Who do you think was the best fighter of the UFC 200's era? Put it down in the comments below. And what would be your top 5, top 10 or top 20 of the UFC 200's? Put that down in the comments below. Leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more MMA and fight content coming soon. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.